Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. And you can follow us at our YouTube channel as well. We post archive episodes of the program so you can catch up if you've missed a few weeks online, youtube.com, and then search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Our next guest, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, Brent Skorup. He did a great piece for Mercatus.org on broadband and the federal subsidies coming to them. Brent, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you. Doing well. Thanks for having me back.
So conflicted because as the federal subsidies come in for these broadband initiatives, we see communication falling more and more into the hands, especially of local governments as well. Cellular communications becomes harder and harder, and the answer generally from these local governments is, don't worry, we're going to be getting you broadband soon, and we're going to wire it up, and it's usually in front of some boys and girls club that kids go to do their homework or something along those lines. Take us inside what funding it is and where the money is coming from for all these broadband initiatives.
So in the past couple of years, particularly after the pandemic response, Congress passed a lot of big bills, including the Infrastructure Act and the CARES Act. So most of the new broadband funding is coming from those programs, and it's really the intent is good. It's a welcome one. It's recognizing the reality that there are many parts of America, particularly rural parts of America, where people don't have high-speed broadband access, or they might have one provider, and it's important to get coverage and competition out to rural areas. So Congress has dispersed a record amount of subsidies to try to fix this problem, tens of billions of dollars. My concern, as you noted, my colleague Patricia Patno and I put out a policy brief raising some red flags for state and federal officials, because if this money is not spent wisely, a lot will be wasted and the problems will not be fixed.
Well, certainly we've seen plenty of instances where bureaucracies, if it isn't the money they had to raise themselves, you can become, what's the best kind way I can put it, careless with that expenditures. What sort of oversight apparatus is there on this, Brent?
So most of the oversight is in terms of just very complex and very long requirements for what state and local officials who want this money will have to do, and what the private providers that they'll contract with will have to do. Again, well-intentioned. The problem is when you have all these obligations and duties. I mean, things like you've got to record your pricing. You've got to have a so-called middle class pricing available.
Scales.
You've got to in many cases, you've got to hire at the prevailing wage laws, which becomes a very big issue when you're in a rural area where there's just a lower cost of living, and these prevailing wage laws don't make much sense. So you've got these political considerations. They want you to abide by net neutrality provisions. So you've got political provisions in there, but also this these very extensive rules for how states and cities can disperse these funds, and it's going to create a mess for state and local officials, particularly as they try to staff up, and they're reasonably they're going to be focused on how do I get this money, how do I help my constituents, but there's a lot of baggage that comes with that, and my fear is, among other things, just apart from the waste and complexity, is that officials will lose sight of the fact that despite all this federal money, the lion's share of funding is private dollars from private industry. According to industry estimates, the broadband industry is spending $80 billion of CapEx every year. I mean, it just dwarfs any federal funding. And my worry is, as all this federal funding comes, substantial as it is, state and local officials will lose sight of the fact that you've got to have an accommodating business climate for the private investment, and I think a lot of these programs are going to complicate that.
Well, we look at it, and certainly it's going to require all these local governments to start hiring bureaucrats to administer this, and which is going to become a taxing requirement, I think, again, on top of that, or it will just take money out of the funds that are coming, which means less get to the people that's supposed to get into. But I want to go to what you're saying there. So it seems like there is plenty of free market, open market solutions to this that could have been dealt with without a federal dollar figure being attached to it. What would have been a better answer, especially with what appears to be at least partially a new Congress going in, to change this up so it's not so much money as it is regulatory reform or things that will help these broadband companies make it pencil out for them to run their own lines into the rural areas?
Yeah, I mean, so a few thoughts on that. One is even before the pandemic, obviously, if you're one of these people who live in a rural area where you have 1 or 0 high-speed broadband options, it's not very comforting to say, eventually they'll get to you. But that's the reality. Even before the pandemic, 130,000 households every month were getting high-speed broadband for the first time. Rural households, over 100,000 households every month, and that was before the pandemic, even before all this new funding. So there were private solutions. I mean, hundreds of thousands of households every year getting access for the first time. You also have, we can't do much about the fact that this money has been allocated. It's out the door. It's now a matter of how it will be spent, and that's what our policy brief and our recommendations are aimed at, which is, we can't do anything about the fact that there's a lot of money dedicated to this, but how can it be spent in the best way is the question. And already there's some alarming signs. So the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which does auditing and analysis for Congress, reported that there's over 100 broadband programs at the federal level, over 100, overseen by 15 different agencies. It's a very fragmented environment. There's not really a coherent national plan. And to give you a flavor of the real problems this creates and some of the low quality monitoring that's going on, it was reported in the trade press a few weeks ago. One of these, this program happens to be at the Ag Department, is funding the extension of broadband to a small village in Alaska. It's not a huge number of people, but it's going to cost over $200,000 per household. $200,000 per household to bring them broadband. In some cases, just higher speed broadband. So as far as I can tell, some of them have broadband already, but that's just not a sustainable approach. This willingness to throw, apparently unlimited amount of money at this problem, it's just not going to last. And so our brief, tries to bring some rigor to this, because if there's program weakness and excessive spending, the funds are not going to last, and the problems will remain even after all this spending.
Well, and then you'll wind up with people lining up saying, well, you told me I was getting broadband, or worse, they'll infer some sort of right to broadband because we've seen both of those things in the public square. Brent Skorup is with a senior research fellow with the Mercatus Center. Great piece at mercatus.org on telecommunications and broadband and this federal money that's been put to it and is out there to direct this broadband access into the rural communities. What about satellite? We see, the Elon Musk satellites for rural parts of Africa and Europe that are doing great things there. Would that have been a better? Because when I debate this with folks, they immediately point to the Eisenhower interstate agenda or the telephone last mile provisions that we go. Otherwise, West Virginia wouldn't have telephones, Joe. And how much truth is there to those arguments that, we did it with highways and this is just a new kind of highway, or we did it with the telephones and this is just kind of like a telephone, versus tapping into something a little bit more innovative like the satellites that Elon Musk is putting up into space?
Yeah, I particularly on the electric comparisons, I just don't see an analog. With electric, you've got a monopoly service, so that there's a guaranteed payment, and that's just not the case in broadband. There is no national or local monopoly guaranteed. So I think the comparison falls apart. The issue is a real one. There are some people who don't have access to high-speed broadband. Depending on who's counting, it's 5 to 10% of Americans in very rural areas. And I think you're right. I think for a small sliver of Americans, satellite broadband is probably the right answer, and not like I mentioned, in one instance of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars per household. In some instances, it will make sense to extend, say, fiber optics out. If it can be done at modest cost, and that is the case in many areas. In other cases, it'll be fixed wireless. For some people, it'll be their cell phone is enough. But there's a mix of solutions out there, and unfortunately, the federal government has kind of tipped the scales to this fiber optics only view. It's not. They don't. It's not. That's not completely their view, but they're definitely lean that way.
Do you think that there's more afoot here? And I hate to hate to be that guy. I often go to the simplest answer, and the simplest answer is this is usually a great way for an elected official to be able to say, "Look at what I've done. I've passed this bill. I've created this money, and now you can stop emailing my office saying I don't have good internet connection." But there are those who will say there's more afoot here, that the government wants to control the internet so that they can, do surveillance without having to get a wiretap or any sort of a warrant, because they're the ones that have laid the cable. Are there legitimate concerns about that? If the government's giving you the internet, then whatever you do over the internet is basically something the government can keep an eye on?
Yeah, any movement has, different motivations and different views. In the broadband movement, there's certainly some of that going on. But I think that's not my main concern with this. It really is a spending and waste concern. Sure. I think the surveillance issues are real. But I think they're largely distinct from the broadband.
Now you mentioned.
Go ahead.
You had mentioned $200,000 to hook up the house, but so that's a one-time thing, or is there going to need to be a continuing stream of federal funding for each house? And does this trickle down into now subsidizing lower income families? You mentioned having to have scales of middle class, underserved communities that will get subsidized internet service. In the case I mentioned, it's not clear, what
if any, if there will be kind of a permanent subsidy required. I expect probably yes. When you're stringing fiber optics, to very rural areas, there's a lot of maintenance involved, and for a small number of households, it's probably not sustainable to charge the market rate for that maintenance. I expect there will be a pretty extensive maintenance required and subsidies required. I haven't seen Congress, talk about that. I mean, as far as from what I can gather, Congress, spend all this money and they want the job done.
Sure.
But it would not surprise me if in, say, 5 years, there's a political push for more subsidies in this area.
Are there places on the planet that do this successfully? We heard quite a bit during COVID about other countries that did other things, but is there a model where this works, Brent, in your mind, in your research? So the U.S. compares pretty favorably to other countries. All nations with huge rural populations are dealing with similar things. One model I think that does fare pretty well, and it's one that I've talked about, is rather than this extensive, these 100+ programs, all with their own agencies and subprograms and reams of regulatory requirements, go to a simple voucher program. Essentially, cut a coupon to rural households to purchase, with their own matching funds, broadband from the provider of their choice. This is the model in the United Kingdom. They've been doing it, I think, about 6 years. They have essentially a voucher program for households. You get a coupon code when you pay your internet bill. You enter that code in. And the government reduces your bill by the given amount. Interesting.
And it can be supplemented by the regional or local governments. So I think it's a very simple model. It's a very effective and popular model in the United Kingdom. I think it has a lot of benefits over what we have in the U.S., which, again, 100+ programs, each with their own regulatory requirements. It's a big hindrance to the private providers. It's a big hindrance to the state and local officials who have to monitor them. And I think there's a lot of benefit to simplicity. And the other thing is, I think it shows, in the UK, a government program working for people. They see, I'm getting this discount every month. It's just much simpler.
And it sounds like it takes into effect that if you're, I don't know, pick the Firefly, for example, in Central Virginia. It's a creation of Central Virginia Electric Cooperative, and they've done some things with Virginia money, but their own money, and they had their own infrastructure to a lot of these homes. But if it costs them twice as much to send you internet than it does to send to somebody in, say, Charlottesville, then you can make that up. It sounds like. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. It puts the consumer in control. They're choosing the provider that works for them. It might be satellite. It might be fixed wireless. It might be their cell phone. It might be fiber optics. It could even be the municipal provider. But and I think that's a much better model, empowering the consumer to choose the provider that works for them, instead of state and federal officials who are choosing amongst various providers who's going to serve a given area. Yeah. And the other, the effect is a voucher essentially puts a pot of money at every rural households, and providers have to race to serve them. Because once you get there, you get paid. So it has a self-enforcing mechanism as well.
It's a good idea. And it's interesting. Here we are in Virginia, as many places, talking about school choice after a century of public education metastasizing. I think it would be much easier to start that kind of program now before the bureaucracy of government internet, kind of grows its own legs and arms and torso and becomes a creature unto itself. And then you're trying to unmake the monster rather than trying to create a better system at the start.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of money available. Yeah, I hope states and federal officials will consider as an alternative to the various complex programs they have proposed, that they'll consider a voucher program, particularly for the states and cities who don't have a lot of people on staff that they can spare to do this sort of thing. A voucher program is much simpler.
What about, last one for you, Brent Skorup on with us from Mercatus on broadband. What about incentivizing the companies themselves to say, hey, why don't you get out here to way yonder Virginia, past Wythe County, and you keep going west, and say, we will pick up the extra cost, or we'll give you tax breaks for the extra costs you incur, and therefore the government's not actually giving money. They're saying, listen, we'll forego some of the taxes we're taking to you to help make you whole for the extra cost of running out to some rural town. Is there any efficacy in something like that?
Yeah, I think there is, and there's probably some programs like that. I'm not a tax expert, so I'm not going to weigh in. I kind of shy away from playing games with taxes. But kind of a similar idea I favor is if you're a rural municipality or county, and you've got funding, and you're trying to figure out the best way to expand broadband coverage, would be to construct what's called the passive infrastructure for broadband. So this is utility poles, conduit along rural roadways, the vaults that internet service providers need. Take that cost away from the providers. All providers need this. This roadside equipment. They need the poles, They need the conduit. But this is low maintenance, fairly easy to construct passive infrastructure that I think would make sense for particularly rural areas to build out, because it's the right of way access is under municipal control, and so they can do it. They're not taking on the risk of, say, getting in the broadband business, but they are reducing the costs in rural areas. That's
a very nice way of getting it started. Brent Skorup, thank you so much for your visit this week. Mercatus Center, and it's mercatus.org under publications on telecommunications and broadband. Thank you so much for your visit this week.
Yep, thanks for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to visit us online at virginiainstitute.org. Find out more about our education choice movement, VEOA.org. I always forget the acronyms. I failed acronyms in high school. But for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.